to the Chapter 1 of Cowlett's book, Intro to Psychology, which we are using this semester for our psych course. This chapter gives a great overview of the field of psychology, history, a little bit of history behind it, how it evolved over time into different areas and specializations, some of the individuals who work in the field of psychology and their specializations, as well as some of the theoretical approaches are also discussed and given an overview in this chapter. So there are 3 modules. Each module has its own kind of goals, which you see on the screen here, discussing issues, discussing different areas and different specializations in this first module. Okay, I asked you on the first day of class, what is psychology? Some of you had some definitions that related to, a field that helps people who are worried or depressed or troubled, experiencing anxiety, things like that. That's usually the first thing that comes to mind when we talk about psychology and that word when it's mentioned to people. However, we have to kind of broaden our definition a bit and start thinking of the field of psychology as more like a systematic study of behavior and the experiences that people have that will impact their behavior. And when we talk about experience, you might want to put in here the word perception, or how one perceives things, because that particular idea is huge. There's a chapter on perception itself based on senses and sensory issues, and that particular idea is what people need to work on when it comes to identifying their senses, how that leads to their experiences, and how that then impacts their behavior in some way. Okay, there are some general points about psychology that we need to keep in mind. The first one is it depends. You as a person have often probably said this when someone asks you, well, would you like to do this or this? And someone would say, well, it kind of depends. And then you might go into, well, what does it depend on? Okay, it depends on how tired I am, how many other things I have to do, if I can, let's say, go out now or I have to wait till later. There's always that it depends statement. So the thing to remember here is that behavior really does always depend on something else. The key for us is actually knowing what it depends on, identifying it and figuring it out. Okay. The second general point to remember is that when we're looking at progress in the psychological field, we're looking at, can we have a good measurement tool or a way to measure things that say, okay, someone has made progress in this area or in that area. Some areas we can clearly measure, such as learning and memory, for example, which tend to have progress happen a lot faster. An example would be someone who's trying to increase their memory, they memorize 25 words one week, and then the next week they're able to memorize 50 words. We can clearly measure to show that they're able to do both of those things, okay, from one week to the next, because we would just have them write out the 25 words they memorized, and then the next week write out the 50 words they've memorized. Clear measurement. They either can do it or they can't. Unlike other areas where things are not as clearly and easily measured, such as emotions and personality. Even though we could say, oh, that person's always happy. How are we measuring that? Are we measuring happiness or someone being happy based on their smiles, their facial expressions? Is it based on their mannerisms? Is it based on the things that they're doing? Like it's a little bit more of a gray area when it comes to measuring, and as a result, we can't necessarily show clear progress because we don't have that really identifiable good measurement. Okay, and the third general point to remember is that we have to have confidence in the conclusions that we reach when we measure, and it has to be strong evidence that gets us there. So again, this is a pretty self-explanatory statement, but we really need to evaluate whatever evidence is presented to us. So, for example, if a research study is done and only 10 people are used, and the results are really only about those 10 people, can we really say, okay, well, then this really applies to the whole population? But if we did a general study and we had 1,000 people in it, can we say, okay, this applies to, this group of people or this group of people. We really have to look at what evidence was collected in order for us to say, okay, I'm confident in this conclusion because this evidence is really strong. We can clearly see some sort of progress or measurement that was done. Okay, so general points to remember. The next slide, and then a few slides beyond this one, actually describe each of these what we call profound philosophical questions. Okay, this idea of free will versus determinism, the mind-brain problem, and the nature-nurture issue. Okay, looking at the first one, the free will versus determinism. Free will is kind of a person makes these independent decisions, and it causes a certain behavior. So they decide to do something and they behave in a way that goes with that decision. It's not so clear cut for someone else looking at another person making a decision based on their free will. We're not exactly sure why they made that decision or what went into their decision making, versus determinism, which is more clear cut. Okay, I'm going to go to that slide here. More clear cut because everything that happens has a cause that we can actually identify or observe and measure. We can clearly say, okay, this happened because of this, period, end of statement, we know already. Unlike free will, where we kind of have to look at more factors, there's not a real clear-cut reason why something happened or behavior happened in some way. So when you think about behavior, you yourself, everything you do personally has been caused by something else in your life, but you know, making your behavior a bit predictable as a result. But is it really predictable? Is would you make that same decision exactly again if that same situation came up? The answer is usually no, because there'd be other factors that might come into play. Okay. So we have free will versus determinism. The second one is the mind-brain problem. When we look at the mind-brain, think of these as kind of there's two views. Okay, now you say, well, isn't the mind the same thing as the brain? And that's where these two views of that come in. Some people say yes, some people say no. The two views have to do with dualism and monism. Now, if you want, I would circle the word dual, D-U-A-L, in the word dualism, because it kind of implies and denotes two things. When something is dual, there's two things. So in this case, the mind is separate from the brain. So we have the mind as one entity, if you want to say, and we have the brain as another entity. But they are connected in that somehow, the mind still controls the brain, and therefore, because we know the brain controls the rest of the body and the body systems, there's that connection there. So even though they're two separate things, one, the mind controls, two, the brain, even though they're two separate entities. Okay, so there's that view of dualism. Then we have this view of monism, and a good way you might want to do this to remember it is circle the M, the first M in monism, and then circle the word is in the word monism. And you can think of it as mental, for M, activity is, and there's the word is, brain activity. Okay, so if you think about it that way, mental activity is brain activity. What it's really saying is, whatever mental activity we're actually engaged in, whether it's thinking or problem solving or trying to, distinguish between choices, we can actually measure what's going on in our physical brain. There's this piece that says, okay, here's what we're doing mentally, and we can actually measure it because the connection there is clear. We cannot separate out the two. They must work together. Okay, so ideas to think about when it comes to the mind-brain problem. Okay, the third philosophical issue is this nature-nurture. And what this comes down to is how people are behaving, and the differences we see in that are the result of heredity, which has to do with their genes and things they were born inherently with, and the environment they live in that has an influence on how they behave. So a lot of times we talk about this nature-nurture issue when it comes to children because we are trying to identify things that genetically they were born with that the environment then kind of acts upon, and it can, cause certain things to result as a behavior and certain things to not. Okay. So again, we can't change genetics and heredity, but based on the environment, we can maybe change their responses to things and the way they behave, um, based on, what kind of nurturing we give in the environment. So they are definitely connected. But we have a bit more control over nurturing than we do over the nature part, because that's the inherent genetic code, think of it that way, that we can't change at that point. Okay, so those are three big philosophical issues. All right, now the rest of this module kind of goes into psychologists and where they work, as well as their different specializations. If you're thinking of a field, the field of psychology as your possible career field, but if you just look at this chart, it really kind of focuses in on what I like to circle as the three largest areas, which would be education, okay, healthcare, and then private practice, which is, I think, the one that most people think of when they think of psychologists, as being counselors and helping people who are troubled, depressed, or, dealing with anxiety and other issues. But the three fields of private practice, education, and healthcare do take over most of this particular graph. So we have, again, this great chart which talks about the different types of therapists and their actual kind of titles. And then the education that's required. I don't want to spend too much time on this, pretty self explanatory. But the big piece you might want to write on the top of this whole table is that these are service providers. They're providing a service to individuals. That's a huge piece to write on top. They're providing a service to individuals. Like a clinical psychologist often works closely with a psychiatrist. The psychologist will help with problems, whereas the psychiatrist will help with problems, but also be able to prescribe medication because they're a medical doctor, an MD, for short. Okay, they often work together. Okay, a psychoanalyst helps to uncover some unconscious thoughts and feelings that someone may have using Freudian methods. At times, psychiatric nurse is someone who assists in those four above areas. There's clinical social workers, which are very similar to a clinical psychologist. However, they just get some different training. And then you have a counseling psychologist, which often does more of educational, vocational, marriage, health related decisions, and they counsel those individuals in those areas. And then a forensic psychologist is always an interesting field because they have training in legal issues, where they give advice then to police, lawyers, courts in certain cases. Okay. This chart breaks it down into specializations in psychology. And this chart, you might want to write at the top that these are service providers to organizations. So the first chart was on service providers to individuals. And this chart is actually service providers to larger groups or organizations. So, you have like a biopsychologist, which, also known as a behavioral neuroscientist. They have a general interest in the brain and how that affects behavior, and they'll look at things like, what kind of body signals would kind of say, hey, I'm hungry, or hey, I'm full, I don't need to eat anymore. They would delve into that. And again, the rest of them are listed with their kind of general interest. And the questions on the right hand side are excellent to really kind of see the difference among these different providers. Okay, this second table here is just an expansion and a little bit other specializations when it comes to educational psychology. I'm going to point out the one in the middle that says evolutionary psychologist. This is a really interesting one because their general interest is in, how behavior has evolved in our historical society. And so they would, for example, look at a research topic or be interested in kind of saying, hey, how did the facial expressions of people and showing their emotions kind of evolve over time? Did it start one way and end another way? There's a chapter later on that we're going to talk about facial expressions and how there are just certain facial expressions that over time have evolved, and they are very common to all cultures in our world, okay, globally. So that's going to be an interesting topic. And then there's a third slide, 3 of 3. Again, more of these specializations. Like a learning and motivation. This is one of my favorites because motivation it has to do with reinforcement and punishment. Like what motivates you to do something, to study, to do well at work, to get up in the morning, and there's ideas about reinforcing behaviors and then punishing behaviors to get them to stop, versus reinforcing them to get someone to continue to do something. So that's one of my favorite areas personally. Then there's a psychometrician, which works with numbers a great deal. So this is that person that does a lot of statistical analysis on intelligence, IQ tests, how the test can be better, formulated, all that kind of stuff. And then, of course, at the bottom, a social psychologist is another interesting one. We have a school psychologist and a social psychologist. Social psychology is another interesting field. There is a whole chapter on that in our text as well. Because one of the big things that particular specialization looks at is comparing the behavior of people from different cultures. How people, from different cultures act in different ways. Okay, so the general idea is: should you major in psychology? Just give it some thought. The more courses you take, the more you will be prepared to do things like really say, hey, what is the evidence? Is it strong? You'll be able to start writing papers that analyze things, looking at statistics and really analyzing those for validity, listening really carefully to what people say, so you get an idea and a sense of what is going on at that mind-brain connection, that what's causing their behaviors is based on what's going on in their mind as well as their perceptions and their experiences. And also to kind of look at cultures as a whole and see the cultural differences in relationship to psychology. There's a variety of careers you can enter with a bachelor's, but of course, if you advance your degree into something more with a specialization or a higher degree, you can get into some of those more specialized areas, which are always interesting. Okay. The second module talks about research interests, some of the earliest times of psychology, and then some other ideas. Now, the next couple of slides have to do with these particular charts, which, if you notice in the yellow on the top, those are world events that have happened starting in the 1400s. And then at the bottom are psychology events, kind of how things have evolved with psychology. And the key to all of this and doing an analysis, which, in class time we would have sat down and really kind of delved into in groups, do you see any connections? Do you see any connections between the world events at the top, maybe having the psychology events at the bottom be a reaction to those world events? Did anything that evolved in psychology since the year 1000 really happen as a result of things that maybe were happening at the top? For example, when we talk about like the European Renaissance, it's like a rebirth where people see things differently. And then underneath, we have things about writings of the mind by Descartes and discovery of color blindness. A lot of that had to do with, viewing and seeing things and perception. Okay. And so that's a huge piece, that may have been a reaction to that. There's no one right answer here. I was just trying to give you, a general idea of, okay, well, this happened in the world and this happened in psychology. Is there any connection? So you might want to take a few extra minutes after, listening to the presentation and kind of look at these things, because again, they are pretty important. I will point out one of the things all the way on the right. In 1905, Binet introduces the first practical IQ test. You've heard the term IQ test. We will talk more about those in the future chapters. There's right underneath in 1900, there's Freud's interpretation of dreams. That's where psychoanalysis had its start. Not as popular now, but was popular at that time. And then way at the bottom where it says First Convention of American Psychological Association, I want to point that out because American Psychological Association, for short, is APA. And APA format is what you do when you cite or reference anything in a psychology paper that you you're doing in class this semester. And then the second chart, again, same principle. We have world events at the top, psychology events underneath. And again, did any of these world events lead to research and discoveries that psychology kind of answered and came up with? A couple of things to note at the bottom was in 1911. A good description was first published of schizophrenia. That was in 1911, and because these are psychological disorders that we are going to study in the last chapter, that's kind of important. In the 1950s is a big one. We had the introduction of drugs to combat schizophrenia and depression. So again, you think, wow, that doesn't seem that long ago, that 1950s, that we didn't get the drugs to combat this until then. And then that whole humanistic psychology area was huge. And then 1994, just want to point out the publication of the DSM-4 standard manual. We now have the DSM-5, where they actually have a manual that gives diagnoses with descriptions for mental illness, which is, again, used by, those in the psychology field. So a very important manual to know about. Okay. Historically, we have the early era where, again, we have certain sciences that, kind of developed over time. They were around from, early on, things like astronomy and physics and chemistry and bio. And those kind of just kept developing, whereas psychology wasn't in that initial set of sciences, quote, if I could put that in quotes, sciences, and it kind of just began as, okay, well, we need something else other than astronomy, physics, chemistry, and biology to explain some of these things that we can't really fit into any of those other sciences. So it kind of was the start of actually a new science, okay? Wilhelm Wundt, you say his name Wundt, almost Voont, even though it's spelled obviously differently, as you see on the screen, from Germany, set up the first lab to really kind of get into psychological research a long time ago, 1879. And some of his big ideas was that elements of experience, things that we experience, have to do a lot with sensations like tastes and sounds, and then feelings, and that we kind of like merge them together. And so the idea, think of chemistry. I know all of you love chemistry, right? And a compound in chemistry, such as H2O. You have H for hydrogen, O for oxygen. And when you put those two separate elements together, you now have water, right? H2O. So take the idea of elements and now apply it to the psychology idea. Things like the tastes and sounds that you experience through your sensations, those all come together to form your experience, okay? Your tastes, your sounds, your things you hear, those all kind of mesh or merge together and form an experience, just like the chemicals and the separate elements form different compounds. So think of that comparison with chemistry there, okay? Maintaining your experience is partly under your control. However, you can shift your attention from one thing and focus in on another thing, and then get a completely different experience by doing that. Okay, so the way that Wundt actually tested his ideas was he recorded kind of the way people changed in the way they said they were doing something as he changed kind of the initial thing to get them to react to something. So he would give them some stimuli, and they would actually then report how they were feeling or what they were experiencing. And then he would change the stimuli and then record if their reaction was different. Okay. So again, something just to think about for the first psychological lab. Another theoretical approach and very important person in history of psychology, Edward Titchener, and his idea was about really that everything we experience should be natural. The nature of natural, I know it sounds weird, experiences, where we're trying to kind of describe what is in our mind as we look at something, or as we feel something, or as we see something, or as we touch something. So in trying to use all the senses and describe them, we're trying to figure out, well, why does one person, let's say, describe a lemon as yellow? Because that's just what they're seeing. Whereas someone else might first describe a lemon as, hard, rough skin. Someone else might describe a lemon like an oval. It really does depend on the person and how they're experiencing that object and what sense for them kind of kicks in first. Are they seeing it first? Are they getting a sense more of the texture, the color, so it's all about sensory things, and then explaining kind of what's going on in your mind. Okay. um, Another good important person to know, William James from Harvard. You might want to put a star here, recognized as the founder of American psychology, because remember, a lot of the other earlier theorists were not having to do with American psychology. They were from other places. So James has a book from 1890 he wrote that really created some questions that guide what current psychology really focuses and today. He really did very little research on his own to kind of prove anything. He did more of creation of these questions, focusing on what the mind does rather than what it just is. That's where the functionalism part comes in. How does the mind function? Not necessarily what are the structures, let's say, in the brain. Okay. When we study sensation, we have a couple of things to remember here. Early 1900s from the late 1800s, we didn't really look too much they didn't really pay too much attention to what was not normal. And they kind of just focused a lot on this vision and sensations. And this psychophysical, if you might want to break that word into two things and circle them: psycho, which is psychology, right? And then physical, which has to do with physics. So we're talking about psychology related to physics because, again, there's this mathematical description that we could actually identify between some physical stimulus and then, what we perceived it as. So a good example of this is when there's an intense light, and then we see that light and we say, okay, that seems really bright or not bright. Two people could be in the same room with the same intensity light going on, and one person sees it as super bright and one doesn't, because it's based on their perception of it. So again, it's this physical and psychological kind of connection. Physical being the intensity of a light, and then the psychological being, well, how bright do I actually see it? Okay. Then we have Charles Darwin, and his theory of evolution had a lot to do with animal intelligence, had some sort of influence and on psychology as well as bio. He was a comparative psychologist, comparing different animal species, and basically they kind of use the animals to measure smartest to dullest. They kind of had them do certain kinds of tasks. There's two kinds of tasks that are mentioned in this chapter: the delayed response problem and the detour problem. If you kind of look at the next two slides, this one is called the delayed response, where they had a chamber and they used rats as animals, and they put them in a chamber. They had a signal for where the food was, and then they restrained the rat, kind of delaying them from getting to the food. And then they did that for a certain period of time, and then they let them out of the chamber to see if the rat would remember where that signal was coming from in order to go get the food. So delaying them from going to get the food immediately to see, kind of how intelligent they were, meaning could remember where the food was when they initially heard the sound or the signal. Okay. And then we have the detour response, where an animal was separated from food, as you can see in the picture there, by a barrier. In this case, it was a fence, but by some sort of barrier, to see whether it will kind of take a detour away from the food in order to reach it. Because obviously with the barrier there, the animal cannot go straight through to get the food. So they kind of have to go away or back away or go around somehow and away from the food before they can actually start going back toward it, because they can't make a direct beeline toward it. So they kind of use this setup to identify again a little bit about animals and intelligence and what they would do with it. Okay. Um, Intelligence is a very difficult thing to kind of get, you know, strong evidence unless we have very well planned out research. And the animal intelligence studies that we just showed you in the earlier slides were good in helping to then examine some human intelligence. We have a couple of people, Galton and Binet. Galton was one of the first people to try to measure intelligence, and he did a lot of focus based on heredity. And Binet, as I mentioned in the slide with the dates, was very useful in coming up with the first intelligence test. It was an IQ test. That's discussed more in chapter 9, so I'll spend more time in that in chapter 9. Then we had another theoretical approach called behaviorism, mid 1900s. We were trying to, again, this goes back to our current definition of psychology that started this whole PowerPoint, where it's studying behavior systematically, but also the experience that someone has, because we can see a definite connection between behavior and the experiences that people have. And the experiences are based on their sensations and their perception. Keep that in mind. We keep going back to the original definition. Watson, big name to remember as the founder of behaviorism. And this, again, is a field that concentrates on things we can actually observe and measure. So when someone's, implementing behaviorism, like for a teacher, for example, in the classroom, they're looking at their observable behaviors, such as, okay, a student can identify and list, 10 historical events that happened during a certain war. And we can actually observe them and measure if they can come up with these 10 events. It's not so much on how they're processing the information in their head, but it's okay, do they show us that they actually know those 10 events? That's an example from education, the education field that uses behaviorism a great deal as a theory. Okay, so studies of learning that were inspired by Watson. They studied a lot of animal behavior and how animals learn. There's a lot of advantages to using animals for these studies, because the researcher can have a bit more control over what the animals eat, when they, their waking and sleeping schedule, and a lot of other things that can be under the control of the researcher, that can eliminate those things as kind of variables that would have an impact on the results. And it works better with animals because we have more control than with humans, okay? And the thought is that non-human learning might be simpler to understand, but the key word there is might, because it's interesting. There's a case in the book that talks about the early behaviorists actually were studying the rats in those mazes. Do you ever see a maze? It's in the textbook. There's a nice picture. A rat trying to follow a maze through something. They thought that would be really simple to understand their behavior in following, the path in the maze, but it ended up where it was actually being far more complicated than they originally thought. So they actually abandoned some of those studies and turned to other ways to actually explain learning in non-humans, okay? Then the last couple of slides kind of give a little kind of overview of the time period. Again, just some general things about from the mid 1900s on. Most psychiatrists were following Freud's methods. I mentioned that earlier. However, it's kind of faded. The ideas of Freud still exist. People still refer to them, but it doesn't have the emphasis that it used to have. Okay, and one of the things that happened was that when soldiers were returning from World War II, which, if you remember, time period, late 30s, early 40s, they needed help with dealing with the trauma that the war had caused and the experiences that they had. So psychiatrists could not keep up with the just sheer volume of soldiers who needed assistance after that war and during that war, that psychology and psychologists began to provide the therapy in addition to the psychiatrists. And remember, I said on that slide that now we have kind of a working collaboration between psychiatrists and psychologists to provide therapy, and that's when clinical psychology kind of began to develop as kind of the idea we know today began to develop then, in order to help with these soldiers that needed therapy after or during World War II. Okay, and some recent trends to finish it off. Most of today's psychologists, and you should kind of adopt this attitude, you can't really find one theory to explain things, because there's just not one idea or way to explain things. We have to start understanding experiences that people have, and we have to look at a variety of theoretical things to try to explain it. And most psychologists today attempt to answer kind of more limited questions. They'll look at basic research, which kind of just seeks out some information to kind of add to the knowledge base, and then applied research, which kind of it studies dealing with some practical problems and how we can apply what we learned in the basic research to the problems that people have in today's society. And then finally, starting in the 1960s, this idea of cognitive psychology started, where we started to look at thought processes and knowledge and how one impacted the other, and other fields under the psychology umbrella, neuroscience, the evolutionary psychology that I mentioned earlier, and then this whole idea of positive psychology, where in the past we might have started looking at negative things like fear and anger and sadness and studied, okay, well, why, what makes people sad, what makes people fearful and angry, whereas positive psychology does the opposite. It kind of looks at what experiences people have and what genes kind of predispose them to make them happy, productive, and successful. So it's almost like putting a positive spin on what we in the past used to do negatively. Okay. Also, new fields have kind of arisen in psychology, things like health psychology, which is a great field. All of the research that has been done is now kind of looking at people's health and things that influence how they behave, and how those behaviors are either promoting their health in positive ways or not so much, based on what they're doing, like smoking, drinking, certain not exercising, and how that can negatively impact them versus the things they should be doing to positively impact. And then sports psychology, another great field, applying psychological principles to help athletes, set goals, train, and concentrate. Okay. So again, the key to remember here is that psychologists today really have to look at more things, and they also have to look at it in the bigger picture of human diversity, meaning in the past, a lot of studies and research was conducted just on men, whereas now we have to look more at the diversity of the human being in reference to women, in reference to minority populations, and things that they experience and their behavioral trends. So it's just something to think about. So again, this is a great chapter to give you a good overview, and please go, and if you have not read it yet, please do so. Okay, well, we'll talk again. Thanks. See you in class.